Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. Mark, great to have you here from the other side of the world in Australia. So to start with, please introduce yourself and tell everybody about the great work that you do.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I'm Dr. Mark Williams. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I've worked as a cognitive neuroscientist in schools, in university, sorry, for 25 odd years. And then gave that all up about 4 years ago to start working with schools and organizations about creating brain-friendly environments so that everyone can thrive. And then I have a new book out, well, it's almost 12 months now, The Connected Species, which is all around the fact that we need to be more connected and stop some of the issues that are happening in the world today. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, you read The Connected Species. It's got some tips and tricks at the end of each chapter as to how we can all become more connected based on neuroscience or how our brains work. And I think we need to start designing our worlds based on our brains rather than designing our world so that a few people make lots of money.
Wow. Okay. And I've got a follow-up question. So neuroscience, it seems to me that this is one of the areas in the world that is kind of going so fast at the moment. And we're kind of discovering things that perhaps now prove things that people, for instance, in indigenous areas of the world were already practicing, for instance. Have you got any comment on that?
Yeah, I think what we forget is that our brains really haven't changed over the last 50,000 years. We still have the same grey, squishy brains that we had 50,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers. We're wandering around and we had lots of time to sit around and chat and spend time with each other. And our brains are still that same brain. Just because we call the latest kids digital natives doesn't mean that their brains are any different to the brains we had 50,000 years ago, and they're not. And so we need to realize that, and we need to start slowing down and actually working with each other. And we got to where we are now because of the fact that we collaborated, right? It's only been in the last 2,000 years or so the competition and this whole idea of patriarchy's come about. But prior to that, we actually worked together to actually help each other to thrive. And we need to get back to that because that's really the way our brains have evolved and what our brains have evolved to do. And that's how we thrive, right? That being empathic and helping someone causes a huge amount of endorphins released in your brain. So the helper actually, has more benefit than the person being helped. So we need to be doing that. We need to be doing that more. And it's really important that we do.
Yeah, I was, funnily enough, I was just reading about this over the weekend about how we are hardwired for kindness, but then our environment kind of drums it out of us because of the way we've set things up, which is, in one way is sad, but on the other hand, it gives hope, I think, because, you know, if it's innate and natural, then all we got to do is sort the rest out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we come from the last 2,000 years, it's been around a feudal system, right? And all of the strangest thing I think we have is a justice system which is designed based on competition. It's based on this idea that you have two sides fighting against each other, and the winner is the one that is rewarded. That's not justice. Justice should be about finding out the truth and then working towards some sort of reconciliation. So, I mean, and that's only one example of the many ways our system's set up for us to actually fight against each other because we've come from this feudal system over the last couple of thousand years. And we need to change that and go back to the way we used to be.
Yeah,
And I'm not saying go backwards. I'm just saying let's take what we've got now and use it in a way which is beneficial to all of us rather than having it beneficial to, the few,
yeah.
the 0.1%ers.
It's weird that you touch on justice because I find that whole system fascinating as well. And I came across the way that Zulu tribes deal with somebody who's done something wrong. And what they do is make them stand in the center of a circle of elders, and the elders tell them about all of the good stuff that the elders have seen them do in their lives previously. And and that's it. That's the job done.
Yeah, and if you look at a lot of the old tribal methods, it was all around It was either that or it was, you get shunned, so you have to leave the tribe for a certain amount of time, which is the worst thing that could happen to you, right? Is actually having to go away and not actually spend time with everybody else. And I think, the worst punishments we can dish out is solitary confinement. It causes psychosis, it causes all sorts of really damaging effects on us because we want to be with people and we want to actually interact with people and we want to spend time with people. And I think we've got to be more aware of that's that's the way our brains have evolved, and that's what we really want to do. Which of course is why COVID was so damaging for a lot of us because we were isolated and we were told that everyone's dirty and we've got to stay away from them, and a lot of people suffered because of it.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? I thought this might happen. I'm getting totally distracted having a brilliant conversation already,
We had a
but
job to do,
we got to
didn't
get into the values jam. So I'm going to tip out cards, and there are like 60 cards in here. And so, how many piles of cards would you like me to make in front of me, Mark?
I have to go with three. I used to play poker a lot, so it's got to be three
Did
for
you?
me.
Okay. Well, do I need to be wary then?
No, not at all. I was never good.
All right. So pile one is on my left and pile three is on my right. So which pile would you like?
We'll go with pile two.
Two. And I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 16 cards. So a number between 1 and 16.
Lucky number seven.
7.
Yes. When I was
Well,
a kid, I won a frog jumping competition with number seven. So it's been my lucky number ever since. I don't think that I ever won anything since number seven.
were you doing the jumping or what?
No, the frog was doing the jumping. I just picked number seven.
Well, this is what you've drawn today.
Faith. Oh, wow.
And so the first question is this: what does faith mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Oh, that's a doozy, isn't it? You've stunned me. Not many people stun me on podcasts, to be honest, but that one has really struck me. I think faith to me is a belief in humankind. I think it's a belief that we're all kind, and we actually want to be kind. A lot of people are shocked when I talk about some of the schools I go to and some of the kids that I want to work with, which are usually kids in gangs and so on. And I love doing that work because the kids are so keen to have anybody actually spend time with them, have anybody actually, value them at all. And you see the change in them very, very, very quickly. I think it's that faith in each other that I have and I love, and not something I've had always, but something that since doing neuroscience, which is strange to go into neuroscience and become a neuroscientist, and then all of a sudden have more faith in people. But it really has given me a lot more faith in people and people around me. And I also I must admit I'm not a religious, as in the more standard ideas of religion. But I surf a lot and it gives me what I need. I was out surfing the other day and a pod of dolphins came up, and I'd had a stressful couple of weeks, a lot of work, and it was the first time I'd had a surf for a little while, and it just seemed to work at the right time. I think that the world brings us what we need and who we need at the right time, I think, or
Well,
what we need.
what a great opening, Mark. And that it's interesting how much you had to pause before you dived into that and then where you went with it. So when you were talking, I was thinking about how faith kind of you touched on belief. And faith is kind of belief almost in an extreme form when it doesn't seem to be logical or able to explain sometimes. And then you went on to explain how you seem to, your faith seems to have grown since you got into neuroscience. And that seems to be a contradiction in some ways, because faith, on the one hand, is this kind of inexplainable extreme of belief, whereas neuroscience is all about science. How do those two go together?
Yes, I think it's because I've discovered, and we've discovered in neuroscience now that our brains are really set up to want to do the right thing. So if you put someone in a scanner and you actually try and ask them to do the wrong thing or do something unethical or do something to cheat, for example, then a whole area of their brain, which is actually to stop them from doing that thing, actually lights up. So we are actually not, we actually don't want to do the wrong thing. And if you ask them to do the right thing, then they do it automatically. And there's not all those extra areas activating. And I think by discovering that, it really puts faith for me in the hands of everybody else. So everybody actually wants to do the right thing. We've just got to give them the opportunity to do the right thing. Maybe not everybody. I mean, there are, of course, extremes where you've got pathologies that cause issues, but they're so rare. And the vast majority of people, I think, just want to be given the opportunity to do the right thing, and that gives me a lot of faith in human beings and where we're headed.
Mm. I'd like to ask you a bit more about that actually, because I work a lot in the values space, and this is broadly, kind of saying decide what's important to you and then go ahead and be in line with that, despite all of the distractions that might be around you. But sometimes, well, quite often actually, I find myself asking the question of whether that's a bit of a privileged kind of position, to say that values are important and that we should live in line with them. And I'll give you an example to demonstrate this. And actually, it was I think you talked recently to Neil Hawkes.
I
And
did.
I know Neil, great guy, does so much fantastic work in the values space and in schools and education. And he used an exercise on a call that I found made me really curious. And what he said was, imagine that there are two students in a classroom, and one student says to the other, "Hey, I've managed to see the paper for tomorrow's test. And so I can share that with you if you like. And if we do that, that means we can go and play football tonight instead of having to do studying." And the question to the people on the call was, what would you do if you were offered that opportunity? And most of the people on the call said, "Oh, well, you shouldn't cheat. You should do the right thing." But I found myself thinking, well, hold on a minute. That's fine if, for instance, you're from a pretty well-to-do background and your parents are going to fund your education and you haven't really got any worries about that test tomorrow. But on the other hand, if you're from a less well-to-do background and you know that your exam results will determine whether you can get out of that area of poverty, for instance, or not, then I actually could understand somebody being tempted to do that. So I'm asking that question prompted by what you were saying about, the areas of the brain light up when you ask them to do something they shouldn't do. But there's an example of something you shouldn't do, but I've given a justification for it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd actually I've heard, that one discussed before, and in actual fact, they find that most people actually decide to go and play football and cheat on the test, which is interesting. And I think it's because I think there's several things at play there. One is that I don't think we trust the education system, and so therefore, why would it matter if we actually cheated on it anyway? And I think also going and playing football with your friends, I think, is probably a better thing for you to be doing than worrying about a test, and which is a one-off, which isn't going to actually have that big an impact on your life at all anyway, and could be designed unfairly. And the fact that we use those tests to rank people and actually cause people to compete means that it's not really in our best interest to be doing that anyway. So I would argue, yeah, the person who turns around and goes, "Yeah, I'd cheat so I can go and hang out with friends," is it actually the better person than the one that actually says, "I wouldn't cheat and I'm actually going to be," because they're not really being honest with themselves about what's important to, right? What's really should be important to us is hanging out with our friends and spending time with people and doing those things, not doing tests and competing with other people because we want to get ahead in life. And so, yeah, cheating. And then, as you said, then there's also people who have to cheat because of the system. So I think when you're talking about when we do those tests, we're really careful to make sure that it's not based, that the decisions that they're making can't be influenced by their circumstances.
Right.
Because if they are influenced by their circumstances, that's going to it's going to be then hard to determine what is the ethical thing or the right thing to do. Yeah,
Yeah,
because it's not a yeah, stealing bread if you're well off is very different to stealing bread if you're starving and your mother's starving and all the rest of it, right? And so
exactly.
it's an ethical decision in those two cases, very different depending on your own circumstances. So
Yeah.
we do need to be really careful about
Well,
putting those values
thanks for
on.
that, Mark. And just before we move on, a bit of a confession here. When I was 14, I think around about 14, I remember not having studied for a biology test, and I was sat there at the desk, on a row with other people, and I hadn't done the revision, and I felt guilty as hell. And I decided that the only thing I could do was cheat by copying the guy who was sat next to me. But I quickly realized I wasn't made out for that when I looked at my paper and I had written his name at the top of it. so,
Oh,
so that first question about faith and what is it? Open up that creative side of your brain now, Mark, and think about, what images come to mind when you think about faith? What sounds come to mind and what feelings come to mind?
Ah, as I mentioned earlier, my wife is plays several musical instruments, but she's a huge fan of jazz, and she got me into jazz. And so I would have to say some of the old big band jazz pieces would have to come to mind because they really do give you almost a spiritual when you, especially when you hear it live. Um, I also had the amazing experience, and it was probably because I had I was quite, yeah, because of the circumstances. But many years ago with my wife we climbed Mount Kinabalu, which is the largest mountain in Asia, Southeast Asia, and it's a big rite of passage. For a lot of people who live in Malaysia and those areas to actually climb this mountain. And you've got to go to base camp first on the first day, and then you climb the rest of the way the next day. And I got quite ill at base camp, but I wasn't going to not go the rest of the way. But you've got to climb ropes and all sorts of things to get the rest of the way up. And I got to the top, and this is where you're making two steps, and then you have to stop because the air gets very thin and so on. And it was quite a challenge. But I remember getting to the top and having the most surreal physical experience of actually making it to the top, which I don't think I've ever had at any other time. I mean, having kids, of course, it's an amazing experience, but it's an exhausting experience. It's a beautiful experience. But that was that was an experience that I've never had before. And I'm not sure how to describe that feeling, but it was an amazing feeling to have. Yeah, and then there's people who I'm fortunate enough to work with. Neil would have to be one of them as well. Who when I'm presenting with or if I'm doing things with, and sometimes I just get, it's almost like butterflies in your stomach. It sounds as though you're in love, but it's not really love. But you get that strange butterfly feeling in your stomach about the way the impact that they're having, which is also, I think, related to that whole faith thing that it manifests itself in somebody else, and you all of a sudden go, wow, this is somebody I want to spend more time with, or I want to do more work with, and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's I think the closest examples of that sense that you couldn't really describe that I can relate to, you've mentioned the two areas actually. So I remember very clearly when my first daughter was born, And the way that I would describe how I felt was kind of intoxicated, exhilarated. I was crying with happiness and also had a feeling of what the hell is going on here. And it was a beautiful moment. And I've never felt the same as that since. And then you mentioned music. And when we watch things like Britain's Got Talent or The Voice, you know, these sort of programs, when somebody's got an amazing voice, I cry for no reason, because I'm really enjoying it. And like the other day, my daughter sent me a video. For some reason at her school, somebody must have had a connection with the cast at The Lion King. And so they had some of the members of the cast perform at these kids' assembly. And,
Wow.
and Lucy sent me the video saying, "Don't cry, Dad." but so music, I don't know why it makes me emotional as well. And then the other thing that you've made me think about is, you know, you talk about that faith in the context of a moment, but now I'm thinking back to when you're talking about surfing, because okay, you might catch a brilliant wave and have a great feeling there, but I associate faith more with surfing when you're bobbing up and down out there and you know it's going to come, right? But you don't know, you've got no real logic as to why you're thinking that. You don't know when it's going to come. You don't know if it's going to be the next one or in 20. You don't know if you take this one, whether it's going to be the best one. So that's how I kind of tend to think of faith and surfing. So what's that difference there between faith in a moment versus faith about something that's going to happen?
Yes, it's a great question. And yeah, I think also it's with the surfing, it's the moments that happen that you don't expect. You know, I've had where I was surfing in Fiji, in an outer island, and it was a big swell, and we were out the back, and then all of a sudden, there was a guy there who he was French, and he got knocked off his board by two huge big turtles mating. And they were mating, and they came up onto the surface of the water and knocked him off his board, and he was having trouble getting back on his board, and his leg rope got tangled in one of them. And it's those bizarre moments as well that you have when you're surfing, because you're out in nature, and yeah, strange things happen, like two huge, yeah, leatherback turtles mating. Yeah, there is, I suppose there's an underlying, a lot of people say I love collaborating with people, and I have a lot of friends, and I organise to meet up regularly and so on. And I think that faith is more of a constant thing where I like where I am now. I like what I've got now. I like what I'm doing now, and I love my family and my situation. And I think I'm blessed, right? I really am blessed. I mean, I live in a beautiful part of the world, and I have enough money to feed my kids, and I don't have to worry about them. They can go to school, and they can become whoever they want to be. I mean, it's quite an incredible situation to be in when you look at what's happening around the world. And so there's that faith, which is just that the world, that I'm lucky, and that I've got to be aware of that, so that I don't, so that I'm not too privileged about it. And then there's those things that just make you go, wow, when a dolphin comes past, or you go to an amazing concert, or you go to a live event, or those things, or even just listen to my wife practice. Sometimes I'm like, wow. And then other times when she's got new stuff, and I'm like, please, can you practice some other time? But yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. There is that. I think with happiness as well. I was recently at a parent event. I was doing a keynote for parents thing, and one of the parents said, "You talk a lot about happiness, but you talk about it as with different neurotransmitters." I was talking about how the brain creates happiness in different ways, and I was saying, yeah, well, one of the problems with happiness is we only have really we only have one word for it, but I think there's multiple types of happiness that we actually experience. And one of them is that more permanent one where you just have people who are happy all the time, right? And it doesn't matter. And some things, get them down a little bit, but most of the time they're happy and you want to hang around with those people all the time. And then there's the happiness that happens when, your kid's born and all of a sudden you get this huge rush of happiness because all of a sudden this thing is your responsibility and they're alive and they're breathing and they've got 10 toes and 10 fingers and all those things. And yeah, so I think both with faith and with happiness, I think there's that more permanent one, and then there's the more the one-offs that you get as well, which are pretty amazing as well. And we should be looking at both.
Yeah. I don't know whether you've come across the work of Simon Sinek, and he does a talk about the difference between consistency and intensity. Have you seen that one?
I have, yes, yeah.
Yeah,
I like that.
I think this touches on what you're talking about here because, we can have the happy birthday happiness, but actually it's the softer, more kind of contentment, that kind of happiness bubbling in the background kind of thing, rather than the elation and sing a song and all of that sort of stuff. So I think there's maybe a connection with his work there. So let's move on to a more nitty-gritty question now. Where have you noticed a lack of faith?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't. Politics at the moment, I think, just completely lacks any faith, values, morals, anything, all around the world. Well, that's not true. I think, well, in the areas that I tend to revolve at the moment. I think something needs to happen in politics. I don't know. I think we've got better people out there that should be involved in politics. And I don't think, and I think that there it's really sad because I think a lot of them claim to have religious faith, but they don't really have faith. They just wear that as a badge, so that they can get voted for. But yeah, I think there's a real need in politics for us to rethink how the whole thing is set up. I think, I don't know, there's something needs to change because it's not working. It's not working in the UK. It's not working here in Australia. It's not working in the US, obviously. It's not working in many other countries as well. I think we need to a change there. I think it's but I won't get too much into politics because but I'm not saying the right's wrong or the left's right. And I think we should get rid of all of those left and right and all the rest of it. I think we should start collaborating and working on doing things better for everybody, because I think that's what politics should be about, not what it is at the moment, which is just competition between two groups of people who neither of them seem to really deserve to be there.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this is pushing it too far, Mark, but you remember earlier when you were talking about how we are wired naturally and how the competitive society has kind of got in the way of us. Seems to me that you can extend that to what we're talking about here, because the whole reason for the political system setting up in the first place is to be of service to society, right? And it seems to me that one of the big changes now compared to, say, I don't know, 100 years ago, is that 100 years ago, you still had different parties, but there was a level of decency beyond which people would not step. Whereas now, it seems that people are willing to do anything just to win and get a vote. And that's a fundamental change.
I think the real change has happened. I agree with you completely. But I think the real change there has happened because we now have career politicians. I think 100 years ago, people used to have their own careers, and then they get to a certain stage and they'd be like, I want to give back to society. So then I'll become a politician after they've already, self-made person, and they'd already had a career and already done what they wanted to do, and then they wanted to give back to society, and that's when they got involved in it at an older age. So they didn't really not care, but it wasn't so dependent on their salary to get voted back in. Whereas now they're career politicians, and if they don't get voted back in, then their career's gone, and so they are so desperate to get back in just to pay their wages, pay their own, and pay off their houses and all the rest of it. And I think that's what's really changed in politics, is that we now have career politicians that go through university and decide at that level that they want, or probably younger, that they want to be a politician, and they do politics, or they do law, or they do economics or whatever, and they get into a party at university, and then they go from university to, step in the next step into politics. And they're so young when they get into it that they don't really have the life experiences, and they're not in it for the right reasons. And I think that's what we need. One of the things we need to change. And I think it's got a little bit to do with the fact that we now are very ageist in society, and we don't want older people. Now, that said, of course, now we have a problem at the moment in the US where someone's probably a little too old to be running for, presidents. But the president, of course, doesn't really have much control. It's actually the Senate and Congress that does all the work over in the US. And again, most of the people in there now are career politicians that have been there for a long, long, long time and want to hold on to that rather than being there for the right reasons.
Yeah. And actually that it strikes me that there's another change, is that we now attach so much more importance to personality compared to being able to do the job and manage a system and manage an organizer, all of that sort of stuff. And it's like, I heard somebody the other day say, oh yeah, but he's too boring and he hasn't got enough of a personality. And it's like, you really don't need a personality to be a good leader, right? But we seem to have lost that with all of the TV shows that are on and all of that sort of stuff that are just promoting the importance of a personality, whatever that's supposed to be. Okay. Now there was one other thought that so here's a question for you, and I don't know that this is to do with neuroscience, but I think it does touch on psychology, and it's a carry-on from what you were saying about politicians and these senior leaders and their behavior. A few weeks ago, I just read on a local app that somebody had said that a bunch of teenagers went into a fast food outlet in the area and were really just bothering people. I think they took bikes in there, they were knocking people over, just causing a fuss. And intuitively, it feels to me that there is a connection between our politicians not obeying rules that they had set, and then the carryover to behavior at a totally different local level. And I have no idea about the causal relationship between the two, but it just feels like there's something there. And I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I do think etiquette is something that we've lost in society, and I think a lot of it comes down to Gabor Mate wrote a great book called Hold On to Your Kids, and he talks a lot about how kids today are kept within their peer groups. So they spend all their time within kids of the same age, and they don't actually spend much time with both kids or teenagers at older ages, but also with grandparents and older people. And so they don't learn the structure of society. And they only learn because we learn from people who we actually spend a lot of time with, and they learn from people within their peer group. And of course, they have just as much experience as they do. So they're not actually learning the right things. And I think we need to get rid of that from society, and we need to start having more movement across generations so that people can actually, especially from older people, and I know there's some movements to do that sort of thing, putting preschools in nursing homes and this sort of thing. But I think it's really sad that we don't, because that's how we learn etiquette, right? I remember learning from my grandparents and so on, that I had to respect them, and I had to stand up in a tram. I remember recently getting on a tram in Melbourne, and there was an older lady who could hardly stand up, standing on the thing trying to wobble, while there was 4 or 5 teenagers all sitting down, and didn't even think of getting up. And when I told them to get up, they looked at me like I was a complete moron, right? And that's, we've lost a lot of that, and I think it's really a shame, because I think it's really important for us. And I mean, if those teenagers had have got up, they would have got endorphins released, which would have made them feel really good, which would have been really good for them, and then reinforced them getting up. But the fact that they didn't do that means that they don't get that benefit, which means they're going to continue to be grumpy, and continue to feel crap. So teaching people that being appropriate with each other and having etiquette and doing the right thing by other people, especially people who are in not as a good a state as us, actually benefits us a lot, and we get a lot of benefit from it. And I think we'd all be happier people if we did that more often. But having systems around that actually almost require us to do that is something that I think we've really lost in society. And I think we need to think about what we're losing by losing those proper standards, I suppose you call them. I don't know. I don't want to sound too old-fashioned, but I think that's important.
Yeah, I maybe I'm old-fashioned too, and I think that this kind of touches on a number of different things. So it seems to me that those standards or etiquette or whatever, and you've talked about grandparents and parents. Of course, nuclear families seem to be being diluted everywhere. Well, maybe not everywhere, but certainly in many places, certainly in the West. Similarly, there's a dilution. I'm not a religious person like you, but I think religion has served a good purpose in terms of setting standards for people and establishing this sense of community and being a way that young people are brought up with those standards. Not necessarily in a religious context, it's do the right thing, be a good person type thing. And then in this country, for instance, over the last 14 years, there's been a total stripping of infrastructure like youth clubs and stuff like that, that gave people a sense of belonging and gave them the chance to receive standards and etiquette. So in the absence of those structures, it's not really a surprise that these sort of things are happening, I don't think.
No, not at all. And I am a member of our local surf lifesaving club. I volunteer as a surf lifesaver, and both my kids do that as well. And I find that a wonderful way of my kids spending time with older people, because you've got all generations across that, and you're all helping out and you're all pitching in, but also because the older people have trouble pitching the big tents and all the rest of it. So the younger kids jump in and help out and get to learn all those things, which is really important. But volunteering has dropped off dramatically over the last, in that area, but all areas of volunteering. And as you say, we've lost the youth clubs, and we've lost all these things, and even things like scouts and so on. Yeah. I think have dropped off dramatically in recent years. And I know there was awful things happened, but they were awful, and I don't want to say it's not something we need to be aware of, but those awful things were only a couple of people. They weren't across the whole board, right? It's a couple of people have done awful things in those organizations, but that's very limited in what it was, and we shouldn't let that destroy the whole system, which I think we've let that in a lot of places. Yeah. Destroy that.
And in the absence of those structures, people, I don't know, again, it seems that people think that nothing's going to happen as a direct result, but we shouldn't be surprised to see the emergence of gangs, because it's fulfilling people's need for a sense of belonging. And if they haven't got it in those other areas that we've talked about, then if something comes on the scene, then it's going to be relatively attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. You create a void, it's going to be filled by something else, right? We know that as soon as you create a void or you create a vacuum, it gets filled by something else. And so, yeah, they look for something else to keep them occupied. And unfortunately, that ends up being something not so good.
Yeah. And you talked about the intergenerational thing. And again, Have you come across the work of David Bohm?
No.
So David Bohm was an astrophysicist early in his career, but then later on started to get really interested in philosophy. And part of what he says is that scientists are a bit of a problem because they want to break everything down into its smallest component parts. And then he says, but that's not the way the world works. And he explains it, or for me as a layperson, I really enjoyed this explanation. He talks about the nighttime sky, and he says, we look up and we admire the stars, but actually the only reason we can see the stars is because of the black velvet sky behind it, and it's the whole that we need to appreciate. So the reason I mention this is because we've talked about division in politics, we've talked about generations, and it feels to me like it's kind of an approach verging towards science and breaking everything down into its component parts, rather than a David Bohm approved approach, which says, look, society is made up of all different generations. So let's all come together, and the young can learn from the old, and the old can learn from the young, and all of that. Um, I'm just putting it there. What thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think yeah. Well, I actually left the last job I was in as a professor. I was in what we called the cognitive science department, and there it was amazing because it was interdisciplinary. So we had neuroscientists, we had psychologists, we had linguists, we had computer scientists, we had philosophers, we had sociologists. We had all these different disciplines all coming together to actually work together. So you had everyone from people who are working on the minutiae of how single cells work to sociologists who are working on how societies actually work together, and how can you put those two things together and actually work on that together. And it was amazing. And then they broke it down and they separated us all into our own department. So I said goodbye because it was too good, and it was such a wonderful department that was so successful that I just couldn't go backwards. So and I think that's what we need in universities. I think we need to be interdisciplinary. We need to be talking across departments because we can all offer each other. And there's too many silos in universities, and that's why I think why society gets a bit frustrated with science, because the media takes single studies in science and makes it sound as though these are huge breakthroughs, and therefore puts it outside of the context, because they're all siloed, and so it's very specific, but that person needs to become famous, so therefore they over exaggerate what they're actually doing to the media so that they'll get out there, but they don't take into context all the other research that's out there in the other disciplines, and therefore it ends up being wrong
Yeah.
or not exactly what it should be. But what am I trying to say? Yes, I think looking at the big picture is really important, and I think we should always move back. And I think as scientists, I mean, this is what I'm now doing is I've spent many years as a scientist, but now based on my background and everything else that I've seen, I'm like, well, we need to be getting this stuff out into the world, but we need to be able to translate it in a way which is beneficial to the world. And so how can I move from being a scientist to actually being somebody who can work with organizations to actually improve the organization based on what we now know about the brain, which has been an incredible experience for me. It's been very humbling because it's hard to go from being somebody who can just break things down and ask one question to going to a school which is an extremely complex
Yeah.
organization, so many different levels to it, and everything from a child trying to learn how to read all the way up to a principal trying to lead his team of teachers to trying to work within a huge bureaucracy, right, which is all dominating what's actually going on. So yeah, we need to be looking at the big picture, and I think sometimes we miss the big picture because we're looking at the details too much, because we've got an opportunity, I think, at the moment to make some big pictures. And one of the things I remember seeing, and maybe I'm going off track here, but I remember seeing a really good post from someone who was writing, artificial intelligence is going to be useful for me when it can clean the kitchen, and it can pack the dishwasher, and it can put the kids to bed, and it can do the washing, so that I can write books and, you know, draw pictures and read books and all. And I think that's where we got it wrong, right? At the moment, we're trying to get artificial intelligence to do all the stuff that we want to be doing,
Yeah,
and not getting it to do the stuff that we don't want to be doing. And what
yeah,
we should be doing is getting machines to do the stuff we don't want to do, so that we'll have more time to do all the creative stuff that we actually want to be doing. We've got it all asked about at the moment, and we need to go step back and go, hang on, what do we actually want in the future? What do we want this technology to be doing? What do we want our kids to be learning? What do we want our teenagers to be learning? How do we want our society to be run? Do we want to be just? Do we want to be in society where everybody has the opportunity to thrive, or do we want to continue down the road that we're going at the moment?
yeah, and I agree with all of that, and I think I'd add something around how we need to suppress our obsession with proof and prediction, and be a bit more comfortable with allowing stuff to emerge. And just a quick story about I was involved in organizing a summit for people from all over Europe. It was around about 50 people in Frankfurt for my client. And I said to my client, I've got an idea for an extracurricular activity over the 3 days. And he said, well, we're already jam-packed for stuff, so do we really want to add something extra? I said, well, have a listen, see what you think. And so my idea was to split the group up into teams of 5, and then give them a small budget with a brief to create a positive impact in Frankfurt. That was it. And
Love it.
he said, well, what am I going to get for it was, I think, 50 euros times the 10 teams. What am I going to get for my 500 euros? So I said, I've no idea. But wouldn't it be fun to find out? So in the end, he agreed. And so bear in mind, the guys only had time before breakfast, basically in the morning, and then in the evening, either just before dinner or after dinner. And we had them do a presentation, the very final session of the event. And we had people doing things like buying flowers and giving them out to commuters as they arrived at the main railway station, buying food from a supermarket and giving it out to homeless people on the street, buying a herb garden for a local kindergarten and stuff like this. Anyway, the presentations were the most emotionally engaged presentations we saw over the 3 days, and it was amazing. But we could never have predicted that to justify it, right? So it's kind of this thing about either curiosity or faith that something is going to happen if you do the right thing.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And going back to your first point, and then I'll come back to your second one. The first one about not being right, that we don't have to prove everything. I remember as I was at the end of my honours year, and I was trying to get into a PhD program, and I was presenting in front of a whole bunch of professors. And at the end of the presentation, I said, so I've proved that, da, 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 da. And one of the professors put up his hand and said, if you want to go about proving things, then you should become a mathematician, because only in maths can you prove anything, because they actually have proofs. All other sciences, what you're trying to do is get closer to the truth, but we can't prove anything. And it shocked me at the time, and I was like, what are you talking about? It's not very humbling for me, but it's so true. I mean, science, we don't get any closer. We're actually falsifying all the time. We're actually proving ourselves wrong constantly if we're really doing science properly. And we're only trying to get closer to the truth, but we're not actually proving anything. And mathematics is the only science where you can actually prove anything, which is something I think a lot of scientists need to have a good think about. And your second point, I had a good thought about that as well, and I can't remember what it was, which is a bit sad. That'll come to me. Sorry.
Right, no, that's okay. That's okay. And I'm conscious of time. I've loved this conversation, and we're going to wrap up with a final question, which is this. What are you encouraged to do differently about faith as a result of our conversation?
Oh, you're throwing me in the deep end, aren't you? That's a great question. Yeah, I'm to continue to. I think I'm going to try and trust more. Trust more the people around me, and the people I come in contact with. I think sometimes I can be a little bit I lack faith in some people, and I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to try and stop doing that. I'm not, of course, I'm not. I'm never going to be perfect, so I'm never going to get rid of it completely. But I think I'm going to try and have more faith in others, because
Okay.
I think it is important.
And when might you have your first opportunity to take a small baby step towards that, Mark?
Probably when I check my email, because I haven't checked my emails today.
Okay.
So I usually get one or two invitations to do something, and I'm usually a little cynical about. I've had some odd requests recently, so I'm gonna take. I'm gonna be. I'm gonna I'm gonna say yes to a few of those, even though I might not have normally.
Okay.
And see
See what happens. Okay.
where it goes. Yeah, why not? Someone's
Mine,
gonna.
mine is what struck me about this conversation. Well, there are many things actually, but one of them was how we are naturally good people and innately good. And I think that relates specifically to children. Um, Now, you also mentioned being in our bubbles at one point in our conversation. And I think one of the challenges that we've got is that young children don't have a really good appreciation of the wider world because they are in their bubbles. So I would like to introduce you to a lady called Rosa Maria Drummond, who's in Brazil, and she runs a virtual exchange program for kids. So it might be that some kids at a school in Sydney have a virtual exchange with some people on the outskirts of Lagos in Nigeria, for instance, and get to experience a very different environment for a short period of time. And the reason why I think it might be of interest is because by widening horizons, I think children would say that should not be happening in this world, and we need to do something about it. Whereas if they remain in their bubble and unaware, then unfortunately society grabs them and molds them and dumbs them down. So that's the offer for me in terms of what I'm going to do differently.
That's great. That sounds awesome. And I think you're right. I think travel is something that everybody, but especially children, need to do a lot of, because I think it really does gives you experiences outside your own little world. Traveling to areas where you get real experiences and you meet the locals, which I think is really important. But yeah, I think that's an amazing program. I think that's really cool. Really, really cool.
All right, Mark. So you've experienced a values jam. You're now officially a values jammer. Hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. I'm buzzing at the moment. And so I'm going to be for the rest of my day. I think there's going to be things that keep popping up, and probably when I sleep tonight, I'll do a bit more work on it as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me along. It's been great fun.
Cheers.